Well, good morning, everybody. I think we should get started. My name is Neil Bentley-Gottman, and I'm the Chief Executive at the Whitehall Industry Group, known as WIG. I'm delighted that you are joining us this morning for this, what I know will be an insightful session on the economic landscape and opportunities for growth with Chris Giles from the Financial Times. And thank you, Chris, for giving up your time this morning to give us this briefing. Obviously, lots going on in this pre-election period, with the economy pretty much centre stage for the election in terms of growth, productivity and economic policy. So we will hear from Chris in a few moments about his views on that from a national and international perspective. And after that, we'll have a quick poll to see what you think are the big challenges for the economy before we get into some Q&A around the questions that this is raised. So without any further ado, perhaps I can hand over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Neil, and good morning, everybody. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to really do an intro or a backdrop, just looking at some of the big constraints or the big issues that will face the UK economy for whoever wins the next election, and then just some little scenarios of what might then happen if we get what I expect we will get as a Labour government. But what I haven't really done is I haven't really focused into specific policy aspects, because we've got a lot of time after my introduction to talk about that. So really take this as setting the scene, giving you some backdrop on sort of the things that will affect whoever wins the election, and then we can talk about what whoever wins might do. Now, I'm going to try and control my slides. If they don't entirely work in terms of the transitions, then hopefully someone can shout at me and tell me that it's not quite working, but hopefully it should all be fine. So I think the most important thing we need to look at first is the global backdrop to the UK economy. And it's quite important also to say that how the UK is perceived abroad is also quite important. And the truth is that when you go abroad and ask about what they think of the UK economy, what people think, the general impression you get is something.
You've just gone on to mute, Chris. Top right hand,
Right. Can you hear me now?
Yep, all that clear. Thank you.
Did you hear me at all? Did I?
Yeah, you started off again and just went on to mute. So
I just went on to mute. I have no idea how that happened. I'm very sorry about that. So what I was saying was it's important to think about how we're seen abroad, how the UK is seen abroad. And this picture pretty much sums it up. It's a rather troubled place under cloudy skies, with politicians with the shelf life of a lettuce. Now, that might be fair or unfair. In fact, a lot of it is unfair, but it is important to know how we're seen. It's also important to know what's hitting us from abroad. So let's have a look at the global backdrop. First of all, I want just to show you the global growth picture. If we look at, now this is where I'm going to just click a few forward to make sure that everyone can see it. This is the global growth numbers for the past 40 years or so. You can see there's lots of ups and downs. You can see the global financial crisis in 2008, and also the COVID shock in 2020. And all the darker red bars are the annual average global growth rate. You see they bounce around, but they're quite stable at an annual average of 3.4% globally. Now, that's obviously changed over that period quite significantly about where that growth was. In the first half, it was mostly in advanced economies, the US, Europe, Japan, and in the second half, much more in Asia, particularly China, and in recent years also India. And then you can see in the light pink bars are the IMF's latest forecasts, which basically continue the trend. Nothing too terrible, a little bit slower expected than the long-term average, but nothing to get too worried about. These are the forecasts here. What might go wrong with this? I think we should be aware that if there are things that go wrong with this forecast, it's more likely they go wrong on the downside rather than the upside. So I think you can say that one key aspect of something that can go wrong, since China is such a large part of global growth these days, it's now the largest economy in the world. It's also been growing at an average annual rate of roughly 5% for many years. Had a bad year in 2022 when it had its own COVID lockdowns, but is up back close to 5% now. But it's got a particular problem in its housing market, in that its growth had been dominated by housing investment, essentially building new houses and flats, and now houses and flats are no longer selling, and so they're looking for an alternative growth engine and looking at manufacturing. So the chart here shows China's automotive exports, both in finished cars in dark blue and in auto parts in light blue, showing how much they've grown recently. Now, this wouldn't be a problem for other countries, except that China 20 years ago wouldn't have been a problem because China was a relatively small economy. But now China's about 20% of the whole global economy, bigger than the US, and the rest of the world really will find it rather difficult to absorb very, very rapid Chinese growth of electric vehicles, particularly when they feel, rightly or wrongly, that the Chinese manufacturers have been subsidized, and also that it's going to have a too big impact on our own domestic market. So what we're seeing, therefore, is when we see market share in Europe, for example, of Chinese automotive vehicles rising quickly, we also see the response in the political sphere. So we've now, in the past month, had the White House raising tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and chips, essentially to freeze them out of the US market. And in the past week or so, we've had the European response, which was perhaps a little bit more conciliatory, but still putting tariffs of between 25 and almost 50% on Chinese vehicles, depending on which manufacturers, trying a little bit more to stick within what some people might say a WTO framework. But all of this is rather outside the WTO, the old rules-based international system. Countries are imposing tariffs almost at will now on large sectors, and also feeling they can support industries in their own economy. So we're much more back into industrial support and export and trade restrictions. And so that as a world is much less likely to grow quickly than the world that we were in before. A second big constraint potentially on growth is coming from the consumer side. Consumers really have felt pretty burnt by the difficulties of recent years. Not all consumers. So the US here is back at the trend line it was at before COVID. But if we look at the Eurozone and the UK, which basically look the same, we see that private consumption, that's household consumption, household spending, is essentially flat and in real terms, and hasn't grown at all since 2019. And that's leaving quite a gap with the pre-COVID period. Now, you would expect from here on that gap no longer to widen, because so long as COVID is over and the energy shock is over, we would expect real income growth to generate real spending growth. We don't know that yet. We haven't seen it yet, but we would expect that. But that does mean we're not really expecting necessarily these gaps to close, although they could, and that would be an upside risk in Europe. One of the reasons Europe has been so scarred is because, unlike the US, we had a much bigger shock from Russia's invasion of Ukraine than the US did. So the gas price shock is really very much lasting. You know, it's not easy if a vital raw material goes up not just twice in price, it doesn't just double. It goes up 11 times in price at one stage in 2022. It's still around 2 times the level before autumn 2021. And so we're still adjusting to energy prices being significantly more expensive. And that created such a shock to European consumers that because it wasn't from high demand that we saw inflation, it was from commodity prices. So it was very much like the 1970s. Now, unfortunately, another reason why we need to be a little bit cautious about the outlook is because inflation isn't entirely behaving as we expected it to at the start of the year or as we wanted it to. So even though yesterday in the UK we had relatively good inflation figures, they came down to target for the first time since 2021. We have inflation at 2%. The underlying dynamics of that inflation, what's really going on behind the scenes, are not that encouraging. And it's not just in the UK, it's pretty much everywhere. So if we look at the 12-month figures for the US, the Eurozone, and the UK, I haven't got yesterday's numbers in here, but it doesn't really make any difference to them. You can see that the UK had a slightly bigger inflation peak and spike than the Eurozone or the US, but Europe effectively looks similar. The US looks rather different. The US inflation spike came earlier and was rather lower, and that's because they didn't have the gas price shock that Europe had, because gas isn't a global commodity. It's a regional commodity. But everywhere you're seeing that services inflation is still rather high. So it is coming down, but it's coming down quite slowly. And this is what's keeping central banks a little bit nervous that inflation might stay embedded in the system for longer than they would like. It's not going to be embedded at 10%, not even really at 5%, but it might stay sticky at around 4 or 3% for longer than we think. And we certainly expect UK inflation probably to start rising again later this year, because some of the reasons it's fallen so quickly, some of the energy price falls of last autumn, for example, the annual drops will fall out of the annual comparison. So if you look at it on a 6-month basis, so you could just look at the last 6 months and then annualize it, so the numbers are of the same magnitude, you can see why central banks are a little bit nervous. Hopefully I can show you that there. So this is the 6th monthly inflation rate in the same 3 areas, and you can see that actually everywhere services inflation has either stayed very high or is in some sense rising. Now, I don't think we should get too worried about that yet, that this is actually meaning we're going back into a second wave of inflation, but it does show that the road back to stable prices is bumpy, and you can see why central banks are a little bit more cautious than they wanted to be at the start of the year, had inflation just melted away, as it appeared it was doing in last autumn. So what does this mean for interest rates? Well, it means that they're going to stay higher for longer, which means the growth outlook is going to be a little bit more challenging. So again, this is where the global picture is really important, because the same trends are visible everywhere. You see both in America, in Europe, and the UK. Interest rates are expected to fall, but significantly slower, the red bar, than they were in January. They're expected to come down much faster there. And in fact, they're now not expected to get down to such as lower rate as they were then in the next 2 or 3 years. Just to show that even more clearly, you can see these are the interest rate expectations for 2024. How many cuts were we expecting from each of those 3 central banks, starting at sort of 6 cuts in the year in January when everyone was most optimistic, And it's been really quite a learning experience this year that we've become very sharply less optimistic, or markets have, about interest rate cuts this year. And looking at next year, they've remained rather stable. So it's not that we're just shifting the cuts from 2024 into 2025. We're still expecting the same number of cuts roughly in 2025, but just fewer in 2024. So it's again being shifted further into the future. Okay, so if that's this slightly depressing picture on the global economy, looking okay on the big forecast, but there's reasons to be a little bit more cautious about it behind the scenes. What about the UK itself? Well, again, I'm going to start with the bad news, which is that since the global financial crisis, it's not a party political point, we've had repeated disappointment. So what I'm going to show you here is every IMF forecast for the UK economy since April 2008, sequentially. Doesn't matter, none of these are going to be right, but it will show you what's going on in the way people think about the UK economy. So if I run this through, so I don't know if the transition quite worked there, but this is the ultimate picture. You can see that there's been a progressive downward shift in the attitude to how much the UK economy can grow. So you can have lots of arguments about you started at 2010, which the Conservatives like to do, and say we've done much better than other countries, or you started at 2019, like Labour like to do, and say this has been the worst government in terms of living standards ever in the modern era. But to take a longer sweep of history, and you just see that there's been a progressive, repeated disappointments in the expectation of UK economic performance. And if you want to say, what is it roughly? Well, we used to think we could grow at 2.75% a year in the medium term, and now we think it's around 1.5%. That makes a massive difference to both living standards and to prospects and to what public sector institutions can do. So if that's the rather depressing outlook for the UK economy, this wouldn't look very different if you did it for the world, or sorry, if you did it for advanced economies, or if you did it for emerging economies individually, or you did it for most individual countries, you would get a picture like this. So the UK is not dissimilar to other countries in having this disappointment. The disappointment, the gap, is slightly bigger than other countries, but that's partly because we thought we really were doing very, very well before the financial crisis and could sustain that, whereas other countries were maybe a little bit more realistic at that time. So what evidence is there for optimism? I've been a little bit gloomy so far in this talk. Well, there's quite a lot of green shoots, I think, visible in the UK economy now, which we would have thought should last at least for the short to medium term. So we're seeing consumer confidence. It's not at a high level, but it has recovered from the 2022 disaster zone that we were in. So consumers don't feel they're very well off. They don't feel they've had a good time. But when they're asked about how they're looking at the future, or they're looking at their own family finances, there's no doubt it has been improving. And with real incomes now growing, we should expect that to get a little bit better. The same goes for business. Business activity measures, business confidence measures have all improved quite significantly since 2022, and are now generally in the territory which we think of as consistent with quite reasonable growth rates for the economy, not back to the 2.5%, but back to the sort of where we sort of thought the 1.5% sort of level. So we are definitely getting back into a more normal phase for the economy, at least for the time being. And we saw that in the first quarter, where the UK economy grew 0.6%, which is probably more than we think is sustainable for the rest of this year, but it was certainly a much better quarter than 2023, where most quarters were particularly weak. We're also seeing this in business investment, which had stagnated for a very long time after the Brexit referendum in 2016, then had, not surprisingly, a very difficult time in the COVID pandemic, but now has really emerged from that, and we're now seeing business investment finally picking up. It's still not high in historical terms or compared with other countries, but it is no longer in the funk that it was in after 2016, which is, again, is pretty good news, because we haven't seen this for quite a while in our economy. So, and then the other thing that's also going pretty well, and I think everyone should recognize this, is as a service-led economy, our service exports are doing really rather well. We really are a service sector powerhouse for the globe, and particularly business services there in the sort of reddy orangey color have been growing very fast, even since the pandemic. So especially since the pandemic. So that is another part of our economy that's doing well. So in the short term, I think things are looking definitively up. It's likely that forecasts will continue to be revised up this year rather than down. That doesn't mean that the medium-term picture is necessarily going to be revised up, but we're definitely in a recovery zone. We need to see, what we really need to see is we need to see that in productivity. We can certainly employ more people because we've got a bit of an employment problem, but we really want to see that in higher output per worker, higher pay per worker, and rising living standards. So just to think about the UK election very quickly, and I'm only going to really look at Labour here because I think they're most likely to win in 2 weeks' time. What is Rachel Reeves' plan for the economy? Well, I think it's these 5 aspects really sum up her view of how to run an economy. First of all, stability, really important, particularly after the last 5 years. What she calls securonomics, which essentially tries to copy quite a lot of what the Joe Biden's administration in the US has done, which means taking more care about having foreign entry into the UK economy or foreign takeovers. So I think, again, there will be more focus on, certainly I would think it'd be very unlikely under a Labour government that we would diverge significantly on electric vehicle tariffs to Europe, for example. Strict fiscal rules, there's no doubt that they want to stick to a sound fiscal framework. I'm sure there will be tweaks around the edges of that. There always are. Planning reform is the big Labour idea to stimulate growth, and planning reform, particularly in green investment. So I would expect to see a lot of action in the field of renewable, particularly renewable power technologies, since that's where Labour has its very ambitious target to decarbonise the power grid by 2030. What are the constraints that Labour might well face? Public spending pressures. I think it'd be no surprise to anyone here that the public sector is under a lot of pressure, and this could become very tricky pretty quickly for a Labour government. Pardon me. Secondly, taxes are already high at a 70-year high. We know that. That might help if you've got a lot of growth. It means you are going to collect quite a lot of taxes. So we could get surprised on the upside on the public finances quite quickly. So that might be a good thing, but it means that if we don't get that, if we don't get a lot of growth quickly, it's quite hard to raise taxes, and Labour have essentially acknowledged that. Inflation is sticky, and that means interest rates are not necessarily going to come down as fast as people hoped, and that has public finance consequences, knock-ons, and that overall growth prospects and public finance prospects are relatively weak still. So we're really quite at the edge of what we think is reasonable on the public finances. Certainly that's what the Office for Budget Responsibility's view. So you could see that these things could get quite difficult, and again, quite quickly for a Labour government. So just very quickly, 2 scenarios. These are completely contrasting to show that you can tell any story you like in economics. You could have a situation for Labour where the constraints become overwhelming. You get quite quickly some very big pay pressures in the public sector, because we know that public sector wages have fallen behind private sector wages and have had a very, very difficult time over the past 8 or 9 years or so. Alongside global weakness because trade tensions escalate. You get also, in this sort of environment, UK households don't feel like spending very much, so we don't get a big recovery in private consumption, and we get repeated disappointments, and then you don't get good public finances. You can't do much about this. You can get a little bit of a vicious circle, and constraints could become overwhelming. That's not an otherworldly scenario to think that might happen. You can also tell the opposite story, though. You can say that interest rates do come down, so inflation does definitively come under control. The green shoots we've been seeing in the economy, they continue. In fact, they really like the stability of a government with a strong mandate and which talks about stability. People take a different view of the UK after 5 years. They see it as a recovery story. Households see the same. They go and spend more, and then you get more growth and more public tax revenues, and public finances look up. So you can see a good scenario and you can see a bad scenario, and obviously anything in between that. So these things are entirely possible. So I think it's a really interesting moment for the UK economy, where there is in fact all to play for. So Neil, I'll stop there and we can take questions.
Great, thank you very much, Chris. That was a very expansive overview, international to national, on the economic outlook. Now, before we do get into